This week on Just Solutions, millions of children in this country face hunger every day. Black and Latino children and children from single-parent families are disproportionately more likely to be impacted due to systemic inequalities. One of the programmes that has been trying to tackle this is the school lunch programme. During the pandemic, the U.S.D.A. introduced a meal waiver programme so that any student who needs a free meal at school could receive one, regardless of their family's income. But that programme is coming to an end. Our guest today is Dr. Robert Harvey, President of FoodCorps, one of the thousands of food justice organisations calling on Congress to extend the waiver. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Dr. Harvey, it's so great to have you with us. Thank you very much for being our guest today.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, we are, of course, going to be focusing on nutrition, the work that you've been doing in your entire career as an educator and continue to do at FoodCorps around this issue. But we also have to acknowledge that we're speaking in the aftermath of yet another school massacre, where schools are no longer the safe haven, the sanctuary for children that they should be. And nutrition is part of that, because it does seem that it's unconscionable that we cannot pass legislation to keep our children safe and healthy in schools. So as we delve into that nutrition conversation, I would like to start with that, because I know for you as an educator, it hits hard, as it hits everybody hard. But for you as an educator, your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you for opening that. And it is a tragic day for America, as it has been for many years, because this country continues to prove itself over and over again that we are not willing to pass the legislation required to ensure that the most vulnerable in our society, young people, namely those that are Black, brown, indigenous, from economically marginalized and single-parent families, have access to safety, have access to well-being in their bodies as well as in their mind, and ultimately feel like that the school is a place of deep sanctuary. It is why James Baldwin named that to be conscious of what it means to live and to navigate America is to kind of live in a perpetual state of rage. And that's certainly part of what we're experiencing today. It's a kind of counterbalance of grief on one hand for the families who have lost young people, and for all of us who are educators who knows what it means to look in the eyes of little people, and rage on the other hand, because we live in a country where we have a responsibility to act on their behalf. So that's partly what we're holding today. And thank you for making space for that.
And also the massacre that we witnessed in Buffalo also showed us a connection around food and the ongoing violence and systemic inequalities faced by so many communities that are marginalized. The fact that not just kids at school can't always access food, entire communities are living in food deserts, and then they're subject to that form of violence. I know that was also a discussion point that came out after another massacre, the one in Buffalo. This is not just kids. Kids are living in communities that are dealing with hunger.
Absolutely. I mean, what Buffalo revealed is that when white supremacy culture rears its head, namely in this country, we experience communities being brought down to their knees in deep vulnerability. What we experience in Buffalo, a white supremacist targeting a grocery store, another sanctuary or haven in a predominantly Black community, solely goes to demonstrate that all of us, but namely folks who are, again, Black, brown, and indigenous folks, are often one community haven away from having to live in perpetual tragedy. And what we experience both in Texas and in Buffalo is the constant refrain that trauma is a compounding reality for vulnerable and marginalized communities. And so whether it is a school in Texas, whether it's a grocery store in Buffalo, or whether it is a place of worship in California, Black, brown, people of color, and indigenous folks are always one trauma away from the compounding impact of, again, our bodies, our communities, and ultimately our psyche not being well and cared for in this country. So yeah, you're right. Buffalo is but a microcosm of what we experience all across this country, a community being targeted and losing access to its primary food resource, which once again positions that community to be back in a food apartheid because of violence, and namely because of gun violence.
Well, you've written extensively about the interconnectedness of all of these inequalities, systemic racism, systemic inequalities, and its impact, particularly on children. So let's talk about hunger, because we are coming up on the end of the school year when many families will be worried about how to feed their kids, because for so many families, millions of families, school is a place where they can rely on their children getting a breakfast and getting a lunch. So we'll talk about the waiver that's about to expire at the end of June, but also the end of the school year is upon us. So for communities that really rely on schools to feed the kids, what is the reality when school is out?
The reality when school is out is that it's going to be a tragic reality for so many families. For the last 2 years, schools and school districts have not had to think about the question of providing universal meals for all young people, because those waivers have allowed schools to not only provide a breakfast and a lunch and a snack during the day, but those waivers also carry many schools and summer programs through the summer to continue to provide those meals. I think about my own former district in East Harlem, where we were able to provide a meal every single day for the last 2 years, even through the summer, because of those meal waivers. And now there will be hundreds of thousands, if not millions of families all across this country, namely in urban centers, but also in deep rural communities in America, that are going to be faced and plagued with the question of, do I purchase that prescription? Can I make this bill? Or do I have to reserve $40 to $50 sometimes a week in order to ensure that my young person just has a decent, we're not even talking a nourishing, a decent meal during the day in the summer? It is why the universal waiver is paramount, and why we need Congress to extend that waiver immediately, because ultimately we are going to be pressuring families, Black families, brown families, economically marginalized, again, in urban and in rural communities in particular, to have to ask some hard questions of what is already a limited amount of economic resource. And so we're up against a pretty tragic reality in the coming months if we don't act soon.
Well, let's talk about that waiver. The U.S.D.A., the U.S. Department of Agriculture, introduced a waiver to the National School Lunch Programme, meaning that any child could get a free breakfast and lunch and a snack at school, regardless of their socioeconomic status. And to put some of this into context, prior to the pandemic, about 30 million kids were relying on these meals at school, and 77% of that were free or reduced cost lunches. But the red tape essentially was taken away, so all kids could do it. Why was that important, given that there were already millions of kids who were able to access either free or reduced lunch? Why was this waiver important? What did that do?
Yeah. The waiver was critical because it removed two additional forms of red tape that we often don't talk about. One, the red tape of shame that often families experience, so they don't complete that application, that income test application that is outdated in this country, in order to even qualify. And so there are a number of families who forego their right to free or reduced lunch because of the shame and guilt of even qualifying for it. Secondly, it removed the red tape of the conversation that kids are always having around, do you get free lunch? Did you bring your own lunch? Do you qualify? Do you have enough for lunch? It removed those two forms of barrier. What we know about the income test that is used in order to determine free or reduced lunch status is that the income test is outdated. If you look at how the USDA determines who qualifies for free or reduced lunch, it has not kept pace with the year-over-year realities of families in this country, particularly as America continues to experience a kind of passing middle class. And so there are a host of middle class, or what used to be called middle class families, who got access to a benefit that allowed their pockets to breathe easier on a week-to-week basis, to not have to make that hard decision of whether or not it's the utility bill or it's breakfast and lunch, or whether or not they have enough money to get that prescription or to pay that copay, or to be able to ensure that their young person goes to school with a nourishing meal. And so even though millions were qualifying, what the USDA waiver did is it invited a whole subset of families who would traditionally not want to participate, or who would not know that they qualified to participate. It invited them to be able to access a public benefit to ensure that their young person had access to a nourishing meal, 2 of them every day, 5 days a week, and a snack, without the shadow of having to wonder if something else in their household would have to be sacrificed. And as the pandemic impacted people's economic realities through a decline in jobs for a period, and folks living in the anxiety and the vulnerability of not knowing their employment status, not having to think about food for your young person from 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. on average was a major relief for families all across this country.
You mentioned there, of course, the increasing economic burden that the pandemic placed on families that, fall in that gray zone, that, don't necessarily always qualify for some of these programs, so have really been excluded from them. And of course, we're seeing huge increases in the cost of food as well. So even more families are put under pressure.
Absolutely. And let's be honest, that of all the families put under pressure, one of the subsets of families that we rarely talk about in terms of who is experiencing this burden are the backs of single parents, but namely single mothers. I spend time in conversation with a national nonprofit called The Current Project, whose mission is to focus on Black single mothers. And when we had a conversation around who was impacted most during this pandemic, namely around food and nutrition in schools, Black and brown single moms carried the load of that burden, because Black and brown single moms on average are working service. And so the economic burden that was placed on backs all across this country disproportionately, as usual in this nation, disproportionately impacted Black and brown women. And we have to be honest about what that means as we think about extending the USDA waivers beyond June 30th, because we have a responsibility to act for the most vulnerable. And what we know is that Black and brown single moms in particular are the most vulnerable, namely when it comes to the question of food.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about something you mentioned there, and that's the idea of stigma. That when there is a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of red tapes, a lot of forms to fill out with personal information that you have to disclose to your school district to qualify for a free and reduced lunch, that creates a barrier. There's a huge societal stigma for kids, and we know that so many kids are dealing with a lot of social issues already in school. And this has played out in so many different ways. There are stories I have heard, from schools, even in so-called progressive communities, where the kids getting free or reduced lunches have to go at a separate time or in a separate line, or they have access to different food. There are so many ways that these kids are already dealing with the stigma. So I would imagine if everybody has access to it, that many of those layers are also removed.
Absolutely. One of the most critical realities that we have to face, particularly as we experience an increasing mental health burden in this country for young people, is the question of stigma around food access. Let's be honest, whether you are a young person or whether you are an adult, nobody wants to have to sit with the reality that you are food insecure. And so putting that burden on the backs of young people day in and day out is a burden that we don't have to place on young people. I particularly think about the fact that you named it. There are schools that utilize different times. There are schools that have separate lines in the lunchroom, where if you're free and reduced, you go to this line and you have a little slip of paper you have to give. And if you're not free or reduced, you get to bop in with your lunchbox and go sit wherever you want to. And as we layer those kinds of compounding stigmas onto the backs of young people, controlling for race and controlling for place, we are increasing families not wanting to engage. Even for young people who do qualify for free and reduced lunch, I've seen many experiences over the course of my life as an educator where young people who do qualify will act act like they don't qualify when it comes to lunchtime or when it comes to breakfast time, so they don't have to carry that stigma. So they'll go hungry, or they'll avoid a meal in order to not have to carry the perceived shame of being one of, quote unquote, those free students or one of those reduced students, because there's a kind of pride and there's a kind of social value to having enough money in your pocket to be able to pay for a lunch or to be able to show off how much money you have. But when we remove that burden completely, we also lower one of the types of shame that young people are carrying as they navigate teaching and learning communities. And what's interesting is that we don't use that income test. We don't use the shame test for almost any other public benefit in schools. There is no shame test to play in the athletic leagues. There's no shame test to visit the nurse. There's no shame or food or income test in order to access the books that you need or to be able to experience after school activities. And yet, the one thing that we have kept in place for decades in this country is we've kept an income or shame test in place on the basis of food, a bare essential for human thriving. And so that just tells you what we go to privilege in this country, that we have not removed the income test on an area that could lower the shame, which would subsequently lower the mental health complexities that young people are holding day in and day out in their schools and in school districts.
We would love to hear from our viewers. Let us know your thoughts on this. How is this manifesting itself in your community? Maybe you're in an urban area or a rural school district. Are you even aware that this is an issue right now? Drop us a comment and connect with us. Let us know your thoughts on this. Well, Dr. Harvey, you have been an educator for many years. You were a superintendent in New York and East Harlem. You have seen what hunger looks like. Many people who are watching or listening right now might still think of hunger in a bit of an abstract way, because we can, if we're fortunate, go to our fridge, go to our kitchen and just grab a snack. That is not the reality for many, and specifically for many kids. You've written some beautiful stories in this op-ed that you've written about this particular issue in the 74. Talk about the kids that you have seen coming to school hungry and what that means.
Sure. Coming to school hungry looks like so many things these days. And you're right. There's a kind of abstract vision that we have of what hunger looks like. Unfortunately, the media and social media from decades past has painted an image of hunger that looks like frailty, that looks like a kind of sickness. And yet what we experience day out and day in schools across this country is hunger that looks like a less than nourishing meal, but a meal that was cheap and easy to afford. Probably the most common breakfast in New York, in urban schools in particular, New York City, is a bag of chips or a bag of Cheetos, probably hot, some kind of soda or high fructose drink. And then during lunchtime, likely a $1 burger or a thing of chicken nuggets that was purchased at a fast food restaurant, another bag of chips, probably some candy that's being shared at the end of the day, another soda. And all in all, their breakfast and lunch might have cost $5, $4 or $5, because that's the nourishing meal that they can afford, and before going back to a home where there's something less than nourishing or something non-existent completely. The vision of hunger is also the young person who did not have a dinner at night, and so they arrive to school late after breakfast has already been served, fatigued, a headache, struggling to internalize and to focus, potentially some kind of behaviors that go against the cultural norms of that school. And we deem those young people as acting out or being troubled. And yet what we might be experiencing is a young person who's experiencing hunger insecurity. And so hunger looks like a more nuanced kind of lived reality, where again, on one hand, it's a high caloric but low nourishing value meal that's made up of a couple dollars full of chips and candy and soda and processed foods. But on the other hand, hunger looks like access to nothing at all, but increased amounts of compounding physical ills and ailments, namely, again, a lack of focus, either sleep deprivation, hyperanxiety, or hyper body movement. And so hunger has varying distinct looks in schools and in school districts. And one of the burdens that we have as educators is we've had to identify what that might be, but also we've had the burden of having to open a highly sensitive conversation with families and with our young people about whether or not they might be experiencing some hunger insecurity based upon the indicators that we're experiencing in the classroom with that young person.
So to tie this back to the need for the waivers, if everybody has access to free lunch and breakfast and snacks, you can just send that kid on down to the cafeteria or insist everyone has food before they come in. And I'm so glad that you tied this to the behavior that has been, in many school districts, criminalized. We are seeing an increase of police officers, often euphemistically called things like school resource officers, but they are cops in schools. And we know the reports, we know the statistics that these are marginalized communities and Black and brown kids that are bearing the brunt of this. And yet there is no discussion about how their potential behavior, which is often over-policed anyway, is connected to some of these broader issues like hunger.
Absolutely. If we think about a idyllic suburban community, you named it, you don't see community resource officers and you don't see police officers policing and walking hallways. You also see young people who arrive to open doors and teachers working the car line. And we talk about the fact that those schools and school communities don't have as many cultural or behavioral, quote unquote, issues, lesser suspensions, lesser expulsions, lesser disciplinary hearings. And yet the interplay of race, place, and economics is that those communities are often also not food apartheids, not health apartheids, not housing gentrified. And so those communities have access to the economic resources necessary for young people to be well. In Black and brown communities, namely in urban communities, the hyper policing that we experience is often the result of us over policing and having a hypersensitivity to behaviors that have a deeper cognitive and deeper physiological reality that we don't have the economic resources to address. It's one of the reasons why during testing time, which is around the time that we're in right now, most schools, urban, rural, and suburban, always tell young people, have a healthy breakfast. Make sure you eat the night before so that you can do your best on this test. When you walk into the classroom or you walk into the school, they're providing snacks and resources because we know during hypersensitive moments of behavior and performance that food and increased internalization and sense of self walk hand in hand. And yet when it's not testing time, instead of providing the resource, we police the body. And so I agree. What would it look like if beyond testing, beyond the end of spring, beyond those performative moments for young people, we resource the body, knowing that resourcing the body resources the mind, and resources the mind provides a young person to show up as their favorite and full self every single day?
Well, there are thousands of organizations, food justice groups like FoodCorps, which of course you lead, are calling for extension of this waiver that allows all kids, regardless of socioeconomic income, to access free meals at school. This waiver is set to expire June 30th, but there is some legislation that has been introduced. So tell us about the Support Kids Not Red Tape Act and what would that do?
Yeah, the Support Kid Not Red Tape Act, which is a piece of legislation that FoodCorps is strongly supporting, both as from a policy side, but also as an advocacy partner, is a piece of legislation that has bipartisan support in Congress in order for us to be able to extend the waivers for young people, but also it helps to position states and school districts across the country to put the infrastructure in place to ensure that as those waivers are lifted, we have a thoughtful runway of how to make sure that every young person in that school and in that district and in that state continues to have access to healthy meals. What we know is that legislation without tactical and technical assistance can often be legislation that's hard to implement. And so the reason that we celebrate the Support Kids Not Red Tape Act is because it couples and partners the waiver with technical assistance that supports, again, states all across this country to be thoughtful, to be intentional and to be humane in ensuring that as the waivers are lifted, that there is a plan and a runway in place for the young people in those states to continue to have access to nourishing breakfast and nourishing lunch, regardless of income. And so we're calling on everyone who has access to their member of Congress to join us in calling for Congress to act and in terms to vote on the Support Kids Not Red Tape Act of 2022.
In addition to that, it does seem like this is an issue that everybody can engage with at some level in their own local community, because it's playing out and manifesting itself differently depending on where you live, in a rural area or an urban area. And different states are tackling this issue in different ways. I know in South Carolina, they've just passed, or their state legislature has passed legislation that stops school districts from sending lunch bills to collection agencies. I mean, that to me just rings so hollow, that you would send a family's lunch bill to a collection agency, mounting debt on top of debt. And we know that then you can spiral into that. The fact that we need legislation to stop that happening, but that is also playing out, and similar types of legislation around trying to destigmatize lunch debt. That's happening in different communities as well. Different groups are trying to get together to pay off school lunch debt for communities that maybe can't carry that burden as well. So it does seem that this is something people can really get behind.
Absolutely. Two types of debt plague, namely urban and rural communities: lunch debt and medical debt. And this is one of the core issues of what it means to thrive in this country, is having access to nourishing meals. But we also see successes in states like California that have already implemented universal meals for all students. So regardless of what happens with the Support Kids Not Red Tape Act, regardless of what happens with the U.S.D.A., the state of California has made a commitment that it is going to ensure that every young person, regardless of place, race, and income, will have access to meals in school. We're calling for other states to pursue a similar ethic, that there's opportunity and possibility for states to reimagine the way that it utilizes its resources and its revenue to make the same bold and ethical and humane claim that California did, that kids deserve meals in schools for their dignity, for their education, and for their sense of well-being. And so you're right, it's playing out in different ways, but everybody in every state can act both locally with their local district, but they can also act on a state level by reaching out to their governor, by reaching out to their state congresses, by reaching out to their state boards of education and asking one question: what are you doing to ensure that my young person has access to meals in school without cost? If everybody in every state raised that question on the gubernatorial and at the state board of education level, we'd see change.
Well, we just have a minute left, and I do want to say that FoodCorps, in addition to working on this issue, you're also very much concerned about the quality of food. We haven't even touched on that. There might be people watching who have bad memories of processed food in school cafeterias. We understand that it's going to look different depending on the community that you're in. But I think just getting people behind the idea that kids can have access to the food in the school is the foundation of all of this. In the last minute that we have, Robert, what else are you working on in FoodCorps on this issue, this vital, foundational issue of access to food?
Yeah, we're working on two core things. One, hands-on food education. We believe that if we do our jobs right, if we live our mission right, that every young person in this country will have access to hands-on food education where they know and they understand the entire journey from the farm to the plate, in order to be able to then do the second pillar of our work, which is nourishing meals in schools. We believe that every lunch plate should reflect the community where young people live, which means that every young lunch plate should be culturally affirming and culturally sustaining. And so we have a deep commitment to working with farmers all across this country to ensure that we are locally sourcing foods that are nourishing, locally sourcing foods that kids know and understand, but also locally sourcing foods that invite young people to change their relationship with food so that it's joyful, so that it's positive, and so that it sustains them for the remainder of their life. We're working on those two things at FoodCorps.
Well, Dr. Robert Harvey, President of FoodCorps, thank you so much for being our guest today on Just Solutions.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Well, we would love to hear from you, our viewers. Drop us a comment. Let us know your thoughts on these issues, these conversations that we are having every week on Just Solutions. And don't forget, Just Solutions is also available as a podcast. So subscribe to it and never miss an episode. And join us again next week, same time, same place, for another conversation on Just Solutions from Free Speech TV.